Our Father in heaven, we are thankful for this day of life. We're thankful for the blessings that you shower down upon us each day. The blessings of the physical things and the spiritual things that you give to us. And we thank you, Father, that you love us and care for us and that your providence continues to flow around us. We thank you at this time for the opportunity to assemble once again in a Bible study hour where we can look at your word, we can consider the things that have been presented, that we can apply them to our life, and that we as Christians can live better lives and be better examples. Father, forgive us of our sins, that those things that we ask as we petition you would be well received, and that you would consider those things that we need. Be with us as we study. For this prayer we ask in Christ's most holy name, and amen.
You will go ahead and open your Bibles now to chapter 11, and we're going to actually pick up with verse 33. I realize we briefly covered verse 33 last week, but you cannot really pick up with verse 34 without backing up to verse 33. And we're going to read verses 33 through 36, and then we'll come back and notice a few details here. Oh, the depth of both the riches both of the wisdom and the knowledge of God. How unsearchable are his judgments, and his ways past finding out. For who has known the mind of the Lord, or who has become his counselor? Or who is first given to him, and it shall be repaid to him? For of him, and through him, and to him are all things, to whom be the glory forever. Amen. Now, going back to verse 33, he's talking about the depth of the riches. What does that phrase indicate to you when you talk about the depth of riches? Deep, but what's that? Abundance? When I think about riches, riches tends to come in terms of varying amounts. For most of us, if someone were to ask you, are you rich? How would most of us here reply? No, we're not rich. We get by, but we're not rich. But do you realize that we're in the top 5% of this world? In other words, we're better off than 95% of the rest of the world. And so in that sense, are we rich? Absolutely. But then when you start talking about the ultra-rich, that's when you start talking about these people who are worth ridiculous amounts of money. You know, you start thinking about people like Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates and the Walton family and others who just have billions upon billions of dollars. And that's when you start talking about the depth of riches. In other words, they have it in such abundance that they don't need any more. How much do you have when you talk about the riches of God? Endless. In other words, there's no end to the depth of the riches. But in this case, Paul's not talking about financial things. He's talking about the wisdom and the knowledge of God. For just a moment, what's the difference between wisdom and knowledge? Wisdom is the application of knowledge. I have met many people who have the accumulation of facts, but that accumulation of facts does not always indicate that they use those facts to their benefit. When you think about people like Solomon, was Solomon knowledgeable? Was he always wise? No, he wasn't. And so sometimes you have to realize there's knowledge, that's the accumulation of facts, but then you have the wisdom of how those things fit together. When I think about the knowledge and the wisdom of God, how do those two things fit together? Does God know everything that has been done, will be done, or could be done? Absolutely. Does God know how to use that for my benefit and for his glory? Yes, he does. And Paul is standing back with amazement. He says, how unsearchable are his judgments, his ways past finding out. When you start thinking about my knowledge compared to his knowledge, one of the things that I find myself doing is when I'm studying a passage of Scripture and I'm reading a passage and I'm saying, I'm not getting it. And then I'll turn and I'll read someone and they'll say, oh, but here's the way it is. And then I'm like, oh, why didn't I understand that? Why didn't I grasp that? It was there all along. I just missed it. They're smarter than I am. How much smarter is God than us? Infinitely. He is able to see the big picture. And God is able to see Jew, and he's able to see Gentile, and he's able to see how those things worked, and the salvation of both. Then he's going to quote two passages. Verse 34, Isaiah chapter 40, verse 13 is quoted. For who has known the mind of the Lord, or who has become his counselor? Now that's a really important question, because what he is saying is, am I in the position to say to God, you should have done it this way? No. I am never in the position to say God should have done it differently. I'm not his counselor. And then you go to verse 35. Or who is first given to him, and it shall be repaid to him? That's from Job 41 and verse 11. And so he concludes now in verse 36. For of him, through him, and to him. You see all three of those? He's talking about God is all in all. To him are all things, to whom be the glory forever. Amen. We need to respect God's position, God's knowledge, God's wisdom, God's understanding, and realize that the way he accomplished it was perfect. Absolutely perfect, without any changes whatsoever. And I think that's what Paul is trying to indicate here. And sometimes that may be difficult for us, because like in chapter 10, you remember verses 1 through 3, he says, for they being ignorant of God's righteousness, seeking to establish their own righteousness, have not submitted themselves to the righteousness of God. There's several other passages which indicate this, but my goal now is to move on into chapter 12. I don't know how many of you have noticed it, but you're reading along in your scriptures. You're reading through chapters 1 through 11, and it's all just very doctrinal. When you get to chapter 12, it turns practical. Now, what's the difference between doctrinal and practical? Okay, it's where you apply the doctrine. Do you have to have doctrine first before you have practical? It's practice, that's the root word of it. I think a lot of people would say, I know a lot of your sermons are doctrinal. And they are. But there's a reason for sermons being doctrinal. It's because you cannot practice properly unless you have doctrine correctly. Now think about that for just a moment. Can you practice correctly without having doctrine correctly? No. And so everything needs to have that basis of doctrine. I was listening to a lesson mowing grass Wednesday by a denominational preacher, and he was being criticized because he had so many doctrinal sermons. And he says, you can't have a good practical without having a good doctrinal. And he said, I wish you folks would quit telling me I need to preach more practical sermons. He says, we'll get to practical when you get to doctrinal. And I thought, hey, that's pretty good, That's true. Once you get it down, because Paul is trying to persuade them in this point, Everybody needs the gospel. Romans 3, 9 and 10, Romans 3, verse 23. All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Jew, you need it. Gentile, you need it. And God has worked everything together to bring that about. Well, now when I get to chapter 12 and verse 1, he says, I beseech you therefore. I want to key on that word therefore. Because that says everything that I am telling you now is based on what I've already said. That's what it's there for. That's the old phrase. Whenever you say therefore, you have to ask, what is it there for? What is the reason why that word was indicated there? And so he's talking about here, this is what precedes it. Chapters 1 through 11 are essential to getting to chapter 12 and going through chapter 12 through 16. So he says, I beseech you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. This is a powerful verse. He says, I beseech you. How many of you have used that word in common conversation in the last week? I didn't think so. The problem is there's not a really good English word to reflect what's in the Greek word. The Greek word is parakaleo. And you say, I don't know what that means. You know what the word para means? Beside, together. And the word kaleo means to call. And so you put to call together. Now the word is translated a number of different ways. The original King James translated in the book of John as comforter. The New King James uses the word helper. You say, boy, you really got me confused. 1 John chapter 2, verse 1, advocate. It describes calling somebody to your side to help you. Now, when you call somebody to your side, sometimes that calling is to help me with a problem I have. Like Jesus is our advocate. We've got a problem with sin. He's our advocate with the Father, Jesus Christ, the righteous, 1 John 2, verse 1. In the case of John 14, 15, and 16, he's the comforter. He's the helper. He is there to be able to help get God's message from God to man, and that was done through the miraculous means of the Holy Spirit being given to them. But the word used in this way indicates to encourage. But it means more than just encourage, because the word sometimes is like a request, but this is more than a request. If you have a request on this side and you have a command on this side, somewhere in between is the word beseech. Exhort is also the way it's translated. So the idea is there is an emphasis behind it of authority, and sometimes it's translated beg. Y'all get the full range? This word has a lot of range of meaning. So Paul's not saying, I'm suggesting to you. That's not it at all. There's some authority behind this. But he is pleading with them to do this. So you got the word beseech there. I beseech you therefore, brethren. To whom is Paul writing the letter of Romans? To the church, which was comprised of Jews and Gentiles. What he is going to say, is particularly when we get to chapters 14 and 15, is going to be related to how Jews and Gentiles are going to interrelate to one another. But right now, he's including all of them. And once you become a Christian, this is what he's calling upon us to do. He says, by, literally, through the mercies of God. And it's plural, not singular, not the mercy of God, it's the mercies of God. The mercies of God is what's in chapters 1 through 11. That is what he is appealing on the basis of that. Whatever he's going to ask us, request of us, demand of us to do is based on what God has done for us. God is not expecting us to do something without having, on his part, done something. And he's already done it. He's already exhibited his mercy in so many ways. John 3:16, Brother Ray referred to that in the comments before the communion. God so loved the world. That's his mercy. Ephesians 2, verses 4 and 5 talks about that great mercy with which he loves us. Now he's going to talk about what we're going to do, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice. The word present is also another really important word, because it's not just like show up. It's not like be present. It means you're giving something as a sacrifice. You remember when the children of Israel came before the Lord to present their sacrifices? That's it. You're coming. You've got something in your hand. The song, I gave my life for thee. What hast thou given for me? That's the idea of this verse here. What God has done for us, what are we going to present back to him in appreciation for what he has done? So he says, you present your bodies. And you got to key on that word for just a second. What do you mean, present your bodies? Our earthly tabernacles. It's the home of our soul while we're here, isn't it? It stays, our soul's in our body. When you separate the soul from the body, what happens? The body dies. And so what he's talking about is you present your bodies, and we could really go on a tangent there, because when Paul writes the Corinthians, he talks about taking our body and joining it to a harlot. And he talks about God purchasing our bodies and our spirits, that belong to God. And so he says you need to present your body to God. But when you do that, it becomes a living sacrifice. Now, what would we mean by living, and what would we mean by sacrifice? It's something that continues on. For instance, if you slay a bullock, a lamb, and you present it to God after it's slain, what does it do after that? I mean, it's basically done. But when you present a living sacrifice, what does it do? Keeps on giving, keeps on sacrificing. So he's saying what we're calling upon you to do, based on God's mercy, is to present your body as a living sacrifice to God. You just give yourself to the Lord. And that's a tough thing to think about, isn't it? Because how extensive is that obligation? Listen to Paul in Galatians 2 and verse 20. I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I live, but Christ lives in me. And the life which I now live, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself up for me. What Paul is saying, this is total commitment, isn't it? I know you've heard the crude illustration about the hog and the chicken offering to give for breakfast. And when the chicken offers the egg, the hog looks and says, for you, it's just a gift. For me, it's total commitment. Because if you're going to be the bacon or you're going to be the sausage, it's going to take your life. Well, that's what he's talking about. more than just giving something, it's giving yourself. It's a surrender of your physical body to the service of the Lord. Now, when he does that, he's going to talk about this sacrifice by saying that it is holy, it is acceptable to God, and it is a reasonable service. Three things. What do you mean to say it's holy? Separate and apart? Okay. Separate and set apart is the way we tend to say what holy means, the original word that carries with it. When we're talking about something holy, we're talking about something that is not common. It is devoted for a religious purpose. You know, if they offered bread, it had to be sanctified first by the priest, and then it became holy bread. Who could eat the holy bread? Only the priest. And if you're talking about something that is holy, he's talking about when we present ourselves, we become holy in our bodies. You don't use it, would you think of taking, like for instance, a censer that was used in the Old Testament, a pan on which incense was offered, and say, okay, well, I guess we'll scramble some eggs on that. No, you wouldn't do that. We'd say that's irreverent. That would be taking something that was holy and treating as if it was common. And I will tell you, that's the point that the writer of the book of Hebrews makes. He said they treated the blood of the covenant by which they were sanctified as an unholy or common thing. And so holy indicates that it has a religious purpose. When I devote my life to the Lord, when I present my body as a living sacrifice, it's supposed to be devoted to the Lord. And that's tough to do sometimes because that's when we want our own will to come back into play, isn't it? Now he says, acceptable to God. That means it pleases God. God's happy with that. There's some things that are acceptable to God and some that are not acceptable to him. When we present our bodies as holy, God accepts that. If I present it and it's not holy, God doesn't accept that. Now you get to this last phrase here, which is your reasonable service. The word reasonable here, the Greek word, is logikos. Guess what English word we get from that? Logic. You know what logic is? Okay. It is what is reasonable based on evidence. It's drawing the correct conclusion based on what you know to be the case. I've taken one course of logic in undergraduate school and 2 courses of logic in graduate school. And it's all about the science of correct reasoning. Making sure that something does follow from what the premises on it. And he says that's reasonable. What makes it reasonable? Okay. If somebody says, okay, let's make an exchange. I'm going to give you my car and you give me your truck. And they're both about the same value. Is that a reasonable exchange? But what if somebody says, tell you what, I'll give you my old bicycle. I got an old 10-speed back behind the garage back there, and I'll give you that for your new pickup. Is that a reasonable exchange? It's not reasonable under any circumstance. The guy may like it, but that's not reasonable. Is it reasonable for us, based on what God has done, for him to expect us to give all of ourselves? Absolutely. Now, The problem is this word's only used one other time in the Bible. And it's found in 1 Peter chapter 2. He says, as newborn babes long for the spiritual milk. Spiritual milk. And that's the word spiritual there. Here's why some translations say spiritual worship here. And I'm going to talk about the second word in just a moment here. But it is a word which indicates here reasonableness, but it also brings with it the idea of it's reasonable spiritually. Y'all follow me? It makes spiritual sense, so to speak. Now, the second part of this word here is service. And the word service, I think, can convey a little bit of a wrong idea, because when I say service, it's something you do. But the original word here is the word for worship. And so we're talking about a religious service. It's a reasonable religious response. When God asks me to present my body, He's not asking something that's not reasonable from me, but what He's asking from me is to offer it spiritually to Him. Y'all follow me, all of that? Well, what that does is a man offering himself as a reasonable spiritual service when he's a good husband at home, when he's a good employee at work, when he's a good child in the home. You see, all of these are indications that a person is living the life that God has called him to live. And what the beseeching that Paul is saying here to the church is, this is what you've got to do. I think if you were really to step back from this one verse, what is he really asking from the church? Commitment. Is that lacking in our world today, commitment? What about commitment in our homes, people committed to remaining married? What happens to so many people? You know, hey, anything come up, we're not committed to it. When it comes to being a Christian, you've got to be committed to it. You can't just be half-hearted. God will not accept the half-hearted. You've got to be devoted to it and show that that's the way you're living. Well, verse 2 has to go along with this. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. There's two key words here in the first part: conformed and transformed. What does that indicate? Does this world have a nature to it? Yeah. And you can be conformed to that. Explain to me what that would involve, being conformed to this world. Okay. Let me ask you a question. Do you think adults conform? Look at the clothes you wear. Now, in the 1970s, I wore leisure suits. I'm embarrassed to say that now, but I did. Bell bottoms as well. Platform shoes. Why did I do that? Because that's what everybody else was wearing. I wanted to not stand out. There's a change in the attire that's taken place in the past few years among preachers. Preachers used to wear dark suits and ties. Now you will find them often not wearing a tie. And that's a change in society. And I had a good brother say to me one day, he said, "Brother, why are you wearing a tie?" I said, "Because I want to." He said, "Oh, okay." And I said, "I want to because I think that represents the best that I have." But that doesn't mean that a brother who doesn't wear a tie doesn't believe that he's giving the best of the Lord. But I'm just saying, we conform. What about hairstyles? There are things we conform our lives to all the time because, now those are matters of judgment. But does this world have, not just in the matters of judgment, but in the matters of right versus wrong, its own style? Yes. And what does that include? Lust, greed, desires. You know, the world says, whatever I want to do, I want to enjoy myself. And what he's saying, I don't want you to be conformed to this world. I don't want you to let the world shape you to be like them. Who are we supposed to be allowing ourselves to be shaped by? By Christ, in his image. So he says, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed. That's a really interesting word. The original word is metamorphe, which we get our English word metamorphosis from, which talks about where you have a caterpillar that becomes a butterfly. And that means to change. What he said, don't be conformed to this world, but be changed. Well, changed from what? To what? Like the world lives, to like God wants you to live. But to do that, there's this word here, by the renewing of your mind. Now, what does that mean? The renewing of your mind. Okay. A whole different way of thinking. I put it an attitude adjustment. How many of you ever had a parent give you an attitude adjustment? That it transforms your way of thinking, doesn't it? Things that you have been doing and you get a little bit of punishment and you say, I don't think I'm going to do that anymore. I'm going to change my mind about things. And what he's saying is here, you do that by the renewing of your mind. And Paul's already talked about in chapter 1 and verse 29, the reprobate mind. And he's talked about in Romans 8 and verse 7, the carnal mind. And he says, what you've got to do, you've got to have a renewing of your mind. You've got to think differently with a new thought. Now, when you do, he says that you may prove. Now, I'll go back to my logic days, and you have a proof. How do you prove something? You got to have evidence and reason properly about it, and then you prove the conclusion to be true. Geometry theorems, which logic's based on math, by the way. So you may prove what is that good, number 1, acceptable, 2, 3, perfect will of God. Isn't it amazing even Paul has 3-point outlines? All started with different letters. But you don't know the original letters, mate. No, they're not, by the way. But what he's talking about is what that does is proves the goodness, the acceptableness, and the perfection of God's will. I realize, and that goes back to what verse 33 through verse 36 is talking about. Remember verse 33? The depth of the riches, both of the wisdom and the knowledge of God. What we're doing, when we follow God's plan, we're indicating, hey, I believe that's right. That's my mind being conformed to his mind, not to this world. I think those two verses right there have a tremendous impact on what he is calling upon the church to do. And our problem is many times in the church, we lack commitment. We lack conviction that God's way is the right way, the best way, and the only way. And that's what he's telling them here, is make sure that you have that commitment and that conviction. Anybody have any questions on verses 1 and 2? I didn't expect to spend 40 minutes on verses 1 and 2, but there's so much there. Verse 3 is going to contain a section that's going to go at least through verse 6. And I don't think I'll get through all of this, but we'll start it anyway. For I say, through the grace given to me, to everyone who is among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think soberly, as God has dealt to each one a measure of faith. Now, the key thing here is these words, grace and measure of faith. Now you can say, well, I thought the point of it is to not think of yourself too highly. That is, but you've got to understand, for I say through the grace given to me. Does Paul have information, understanding that we do not necessarily have? He does. He says, the grace given to me, charisma is the word. But do you know there's another word that's based off that? It's called charismatic. You know what that indicates? Charismatic? Well, it indicates the word is a gift, a spiritual gift. Now, I'm going to go ahead and jump. I'm looking at the clock. That's the reason why I'm trying to. Go ahead and skip down with me. Let's go on to verse 6 just a second. Having then gifts differing according to the what? Grace given to us, let us use them. If prophecy, let us prophesy in proportion to our faith. Now let's go back to verse 3. For I say through the grace given to me. What's the grace that Paul's talking about? Just God's good favor toward him? No. The miraculous gift. The grace given to me, the miraculous gift given to me. He says, to everyone who's among you, I'm saying to everyone among you, what God has given me, I'm imparting to you. I look at that much like I do 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 23. He said, that what I received, I've given to you. First of all, that Jesus Christ died for our sins. And what he is saying here is that I am giving this message to you for each one of you not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think. Now, what does that mean to think more highly? Pride? Why do some people think more highly of themselves than other people? Wealthy? Education? Talents? Abilities? Status in life? Pedigree? Do you realize that when the miraculous gifts came about, when some people got one gift, they thought they were better than other people. And when some people got what they thought were lesser gifts, they thought they were not as good as other people. That's 1 Corinthians chapters 10 through 12. I cannot say to the hand, I have no need of you. Like, I don't need you. The opinion of the Corinthians was that speaking in tongues was the greatest gift. What do you think today these people who believe in modern day miracles thinks the greatest gift is? Speaking in tongues, because that's what they keep saying. Speaking in tongues, speaking in tongues, speaking in tongues. Paul said, I wish that you could all speak in tongues, but rather that you may prophesy. In other words, that you could deliver a message from God. Now, if a person who has this gift says, hey, I'm better than somebody else who has this gift or no gift at all, there's a question that's going to arise in the minds of people here. Do these people already have a predisposition to think they're better than somebody else? Do you remember the Jew back in chapter 2? Did the Jew think that he was better than the Gentile? Absolutely he did. We just finished chapter 11 when Paul talked about the natural branches being broken off and the wild branches grafted in. He said, do not be high-minded. In other words, don't think, look, they are broken off that I might be grafted in, that somehow I am more valuable than they are. Do you suppose that in the church there would be people who had miraculous gifts in that day who thought they were better than somebody else? Yes. Do you suppose there were miraculous gifts in the church at Rome? We know from verse 6 there were. So if that's true, he's saying, I want you, the grace given to me, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think. Don't put yourself up here. He says, but think soberly. What does that mean? Clear. You know, you're not under the influence of something else. It's making you think differently. Think clearly, clearness of mind. As God has dealt to each one a measure of faith, dealt to each one a measure of faith. What's he talking about there? Does God give me the faith to believe that Jesus is the Son of God? That's not what he's talking about. He said, Jesus said, if you had faith so as of a mustard seed, you could do what? Move mountains. But when you start looking at what he's saying here, this is a miraculous faith. This is not just our believing and trusting. Yeah. Why? That he was going to bring some gifts to them? I think there were some who already had gifts, and there would be some who would be receiving gifts when he came. I don't know who all had gifts, but we do know that there, because of what's going to follow, that there were. They could not impart them to each other. It had to be from an apostle. Verse 4, for as we have many members in one body, but not all the members do not have the same function. That is explained, if you will, back in 1 Corinthians chapters 12 through 14, where Paul talks about how each of these gifts are given by God, but he says not everybody has the same function. And there Paul talks about the eye, the ear, the smelling, the hands, the feet. And what do we realize when we start talking about the parts of the body we have? If I had to ask you which of you think is the most important part of your body, well, we'd say our hearts, our brains. What part of our body do you think the American person spends the most money on? Face? Hair. How important is hair? We think it's important, but can you live without it? You sure can. And when you think about that, Paul goes on to talk about, he says, our less comely parts, the lesser important parts, we put the greater emphasis on. And it's important for us as we look at this to realize that we as a body do not have unimportant parts. And everybody doesn't have the same function, but we all need each other. We're part of that one body. And I think this is the message that's going to resonate from chapters 12 through 16. And, here's where you put a big star in your margin to say, oh, I didn't realize this is what he was all talking about. And that is the unity of the body of Christ, Jew, Gentile, old, young, rich, poor, whatever division you find, we're all to be a part of that one body. That's, it's everybody has great value in the Lord's kingdom. Well, in our next class, which will be, by the way, a couple of weeks away, next week, Brother Barry's going to be teaching for me. Then 2 weeks will be our Friends and Family Day. So actually 3 weeks from today, we'll pick up with the next verse.